really, what's the right tool to use? The answer is it depends. And what I wanted to share with you a bit is compare and contrast between or among all four of the different technologies. So I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but at least give you an overview of some of the things that you can think about with regard to them. Salesforce's first real automation tool that it provided was workflow. And it was great for what it did, and it was great for a really long time. Workflow fires when a record is created or when a record is updated, and if it meets certain conditions. And there are four very well-defined things that you can do with workflow. You can update a field on the record that was inserted or updated, or on a master detail parent of it. You can send an email message to someone based on what's in that data, in that record. You can do an outbound SOAP call. So you can make a call out to an external system. Jason, I don't know about you, but in all my years of Salesforce, I think I've run across one client who's done that. And finally, you can create a task. So workflow, really good for a very limited set of things. Then several years ago, Salesforce came out with Process Builder. It's a much more visual user interface. It fires when a record is created, when a record is updated, or when there's some event that explicitly launches a Process Builder. Process Builders can do everything that workflow actions can do, plus a few other things. If workflow, you can only update the record that caused the workflow to fire or a master detail parent. With Process Builder, you can actually create and update totally unrelated records. So a lot more power there. There are a number of other things that you can do, launching quick actions and flows. You can call Apex code. You can submit for an approval process, and you can invoke another process in Process Builder. So definitely more things that you can do with Process Builder. Then Salesforce came out with Flow. Flow can also be launched on insert and update, and it can be launched when somebody or when some other event explicitly causes a flow to be launched. And recently, I think in spring 20, Salesforce released the ability to launch a flow before a save. So somebody changes a record, but before the change is committed to the database, the flow can do some additional processing on that record. The kinds of actions it can do, everything Process Builder can do, plus it has the ability to have, depending on how it's launched, a wizard-like user interface. A little limited in terms of how pretty it can look, but still really handy for certain kinds of dialogues that you might want to have with a user. It can do much more complex procedural logic. It actually looks a lot like a flow chart, what you can do. So you can do loops and if then else's and variable assignments and all sorts of things like that. So a lot more that you can do with Flow than with Process Builder, more complex to configure, but more powerful. And finally, there's triggers. Triggers have been around since a little while after workflow. Triggers are written in Apex, so this part absolutely requires a developer. Triggers can fire before and after records are created, updated, deleted, or undeleted. And by before and after, I mean before a change is written to the database and after a change is written to the database. And what can triggers do? You can do anything that Process Builder, Flow, Workflow can do, and really just about anything you can think of. They're limited in some ways by things like Salesforce governor limits, as any of the previous ones are as well. But you can do really anything your little heart desires using triggers because Apex code is just that powerful. So then the question is, when do you use one of these technologies and when do you use another? And we had someone on our team, a developer named Veena Sundaraharagu, who did a really cool study of performance of all of these different technologies. And she came to some general conclusions. If you want to update the same record that caused some automation to fire, the ways that we recommend are either using a before trigger, that's Apex code, or one of the new kinds of ways of launching a flow, the before save flow. Both of those, a before trigger and a before save, detect that a change was made to a record and then modify the record before it's actually committed to the database. If you use workflow, if you use Process Builder, it actually doesn't detect the change until those don't fire until after the record has been written to the database, which means that if they then want to make their own update to the record, it causes another write to the database, and that causes a performance hit. So especially if you're concerned about performance, if you want to make a change to the same record, you want to do it before the record gets saved to the database. And the only way to do that is with a before trigger or a before save flow. If you want to create or update other records, you can do that with a trigger, with a process builder, or with a flow. Workflow doesn't really allow you to do that other than creating tasks. And what we found is, and it depends on the circumstances of what you're creating, but those are to some extent on a par. It depends on how many records you're creating. It depends on how they're related. And that gets a little bit complex, how they're related to the record that caused things to fire. But those three things these days, Flow and even Process Builder, have gotten fast enough that they can come close to rivaling what you can do in custom code in a trigger. So the correct answer, which one should you use, pretty much depends on the circumstances. It's pretty clear if you're making an update to the same record, and otherwise trigger, process builder, and flow each have their own advantages depending on the skill set that you're able to bring and what it is you're trying to accomplish.